Will's Trust and Estates, Prlgl115. This is your guide for week number 2. Actually, week number 2 and number 3. So you get to come back and review this again. I urge you to come back and review it again. The slides are also something you should come back and review again. As I think I mentioned last week, we're spending 2 weeks on property, and I have multiple courses in property, and you only get 2 weeks of it. Now, these 2 weeks will play into all other courses. And in fact, some of you have had some exposure maybe in BizOrg and some other courses to property issues, but it is something that you need to spend some time on. There's essentially 2 categories of real property, real property and personal property. Real property includes the land, the buildings, fixtures, things that are permanently attached to the land. Real property taxes are assessed on agriculture, commercial, industrial, residential, utility properties, and I'll get into that in greater detail. If it's not real property, it's personal property, essentially. So personal property is property that's not permanently affixed to the land, equipment, furniture, tools, computers, anything that's not real property. And, that could be even, I had a case one time where there was a post sale of real estate dispute as to whether a shed was intended to be a part of the sale. And the sellers took the position that the shed was not permanently affixed to the land because it wasn't, I guess, on a foundation. It was more like a mobile home or a trailer, but it wasn't on wheels either. So we prevailed on that, and it was determined to be real property or part of the real property sale. But typically, anything that's not permanently affixed to the land is personal property, and anything that's not real property is personal property. For tax purposes, everything comes down to taxes, right? But the tax codes typically break things into, so agriculture, which would include grazing, livestock, commercial properties, and we'll break those down in greater detail. Vehicles, motor vehicles, you get taxed on your motor vehicle. Different states do it in different ways. Personal property, except your motor vehicles, is taxed in some states. Residential homes, and then farm property, farm homes. And then you can get taxed differently for swamp or unusable property or waste property. So real property can also be synonymous with real estate. Okay, we don't go around saying, I own real property, I own real estate. But it can also be defined as the rights that are attached to the property, in that real property has benefits and interest in the ownership of real estate. In other words, real estate deals with human activity, and real property deals with the benefits and interest of that human activity. There are some basic real property rights. Real property references the physical property and the rights to that property, and those rights may include right of possession, right of enjoyment, and the use of the real property within the confinements of the law. Right of exclusion, that is to prohibit others from trespassing and entering the property and using it. Right of control of the property within the boundaries of the law. And then right of disposition, that is to transfer, sell, or dispose of that property. If you're leasing an apartment, a house right now, you have the right to possession, you have the right to enjoyment, the right to exclusion with some limitations, because it may be part of your lease that you have to let the landlord in at certain conditions or times, and right of control for that part of the property that you've leased. You don't have the right of disposition. You can't sell it. You can't dispose of it. In most cases, you can't sublet it without the landlord's prior approval. Again, kind of going with the tax aspects, the 6 types of real property: agricultural, residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, and special use. When we look at agricultural property, there's really four different types of property we'd be talking about. Farms, an area of land that's devoted to agricultural use, such as producing food, plants, or raising livestock. Ranches, it's similar to the farm and it can be synonymous. However, the essential difference is that the farm produces food and other crops, and a ranch serves a purpose of typically of raising grazing livestock like cattle or sheep. It's a larger swath of land. They're not out there with heavy equipment generally or big farm implements and plowing the ground under and then sowing seed and then going after those things that they've grown. We've been binging on um, Yellowstone. If you've never seen that on Peacock, I'm kind of out of my Peaky Blinders, hasn't come back up again. We were so desperate we watched Cobra Kai, all of that. But if you've ever seen Yellowstone, that's a ranch. Timberland, it's real property that's covered with forest and it's suitable for timber. So if you've ever been out to, say, the state of Washington, Oregon, some of those areas where they have forestry, uh, Alabama, parts of Alabama, parts of some of the southern states have the pine forest. So you may have timberland, and so that's what it's for. And then orchards, real property that contains planted fruit trees, apples, oranges, grapes, whatever. You see those, and typically right in the south or north. You go to Michigan to get cherries and apples and so forth, or the state of Washington to get apples, oranges. Florida, I've got a lime tree. It actually produces little tiny limes, but it's not an orchard. Residential real property, we can break that down into single family homes, apartment buildings that are, multiple family units, and condominiums that look a lot like an apartment complex at most times, but their units are owned by individuals. And these condominiums will have a home ownership association, HOA, or management that will be responsible for the general maintenance of the building, all the common areas. Maybe the roof is part of that HOA, the sidewalks, maintaining the grass and snow plowing, things like that. And so you pay that fee on top of paying your mortgage to buy your condo. Co-ops aren't really that popular in this area, but in larger cities they are. And co-op is a unique type of ownership, in that when an investor purchases into the property, you become a shareholder in a corporation that owns the real property. Each shareholder is entitled to occupy one housing unit per shareholder agreement. So essentially, it's like a condo in that regard. And it's the pooling of the cooperative members that gains its benefits and buying power by lowering the cost of the members' services and maintenance. Similar, but a little different. And then we have manufactured homes or factory built homes that are built entirely from a factory and delivered to the site and installed. Now, once installed, they're the same as the house that was built, stick built from the ground up. When I say stick built, I don't mean with sticks, but I mean with 2x4s and, not already put together. A planned unit development is also a type of residential real estate. And you'll see those are our newer subdivisions, essentially, our newer living areas in cities and towns. And they're planned using special zoning ordinances. The permits allow developments to maximize the space by reducing lot sizes or street locations. And in most of these planned unit developments, owners have full ownership of their buildings and homes, but the streets, sidewalks, pedestrian walkways, etc., are owned by a homeowners association. And then they pay an HOA fee a lot like the condo people do. So it's the common areas of the sidewalks and streets rather than the hallways um, and parking garage or something like that. A converted use property are buildings that are converted into residential use. In other words, the buildings can be warehouses, schools, churches, those types of buildings that had been, in a former use and no longer used in that way, and they're renovated into residential property. We see that with school buildings, old school buildings, with other types. With the building that I practice law in, which is directly across from the Civic Center, is for all but I think the main floor and the top 2 floors apartments. It's converted to residential. So you can have that. And I think you're going to see more of that as people begin working at home, and office space is not really as in demand. Commercial property is another type of real property, different than residential property. Commercial property will include property that contains business activities, office spaces, shopping centers, malls, stores, and entertainment facilities. Also hotels, motels, parking facilities, baseball stadiums. Industrial real property is another classification of real property, and that includes buildings such as warehouses, power plants, factories. Industrial real property is typically zoned in a different manner because of some of those uses and the need to have, sometimes you have concerns about things that those um, structures and uses will put off, pollution, not being able to be converted like some of the others that we just talked about. Mixed use and special use. Mixed use property is a type of real property that has multiple uses for that property. That is, for instance, it could be a mix of commercial and residential within the same property. So I guess the example I used of um, the building across from, I can't think what they call it now, was the River Valley Plaza when I was in there. That was a long time ago. It hasn't been that for a long time, but directly across from City Hall and the Civic Center, that is a mixed use building. It has residential and commercial within the same structure. A special use property is a type of real property that's usually a nonprofit or publicly held property, and it's held for a particular thing or purpose. A school is a special use. A religion or a place of religion, a church, a synagogue, a place of worship, libraries, government buildings, cemeteries, and the buildings on a cemetery, parks and the uses on a park. They're special uses. They're for a special thing. And they may require special zoning to exist. I need you to start thinking in terms of real property. I want you to perform an inventory of your real property and be prepared to discuss your real property. Be sure that you use and reference whatever applicable subcategories that your real property falls in. Demonstrate that you're able to sort out a client's property into these categories if requested to do so by a lawyer. If you rent, find out how that property's held. And then if it's a mixed use or something like that, tell us about it. If you're renting a condo from someone, that's different than renting an apartment from someone. Likewise, if you're renting a house from someone, it's different than renting an apartment in an apartment complex. So do an inventory of your own real property, and then be ready to categorize and tell us what that is. So if it's not real property, it's personal property. So moving on to personal property. Personal property is divided into 2 categories: tangible and intangible. Tangible personal property is just that. It has a physical form. It can be seen, touched, and moved. Examples of tangible property include clothing, books, computers, your phone, On the other hand, intangible property is an abstraction. They do not usually have physical forms other than if it were a certificate or a bank book or a physical check, which we don't use that often. But that check doesn't, in and of itself, is not worth anything. It represents something. You follow me? It's intangible. These include assets such as patents, trademarks, stocks, bonds. Okay? The document in and of itself represents the true value. So start thinking in terms of tangible and intangible. Tangible property is something that has a physical form. It can be seen, it can be touched, it can be moved. It has a value in and of itself. My trusty water bottle. I'm trying to hydrate because my wife has the COVID, which means I'm probably going to have the COVID. We're quarantining. We're not leaving the house, except maybe to drive to the Hy-Vee and have the dude put the groceries in the car. We haven't figured all that out, but make some of our kids come and drop stuff off on the door. But tangible, right? Not worth anything outside of to hold my agua. Intangible, it can't actually be moved. It can't be touched or felt, but instead it represents something of value. So those are negotiable instruments, dollar bills, securities, services, and something called a chose in action, CHOSE. Remember what I said about your legal dictionary? Look it up. Look it up. Look it up and be ready to tell me in class what a chose in action is. Perform an inventory of your tangible and intangible personal property. Make 2 categories, 2 columns, if you will. Go through everything you own. Seriously think about it, okay? You don't have to tell me every item of clothing. You can put shoes, clothes. But think about it. I want you to spend some time thinking about all the things you own and what is tangible and what is intangible and why. So be sure to use the reference to the applicable subcategories and demonstrate that you can help sort out a client's property, because you have to do that both in wills, trusts, and estates, probably family law, lots of different areas of the law. This is your guide for 2 weeks. I expect you to watch it or listen to it. 2 weeks. I'm going to ask that you remember that our time together is for questions, clarifications, and discussion about these topics and our related assignments. It's your responsibility to do whatever reading I ask you to do whatever preparation I ask you to do, and do whatever pre-class assignments I ask you to do, just as you would or will be when you enter a lawyer's office for a meeting to review some important client matter. Own it. You won't regret that you put in that effort. You will regret if you didn't, and not just for the grade. The grade will take care of itself. They always do. But I never care about the grade because nobody ever asked me about a grade. No employer has ever asked me what grade a student received in my class. What they ask me is, can they do the job? Will they do the job? Will they do what's necessary to do the job? And that's what you're here for. So put the time in, put the effort in, and do these things. And then I'll see you on Thursday night. We'll discuss whatever questions you have, get clarifications, and discuss these topics in greater detail. Real property 1 week, personal property the next week, and then we'll be done with property and move on from there. Then intestate succession is next. Stay well.